the revelation of Jesus Christ. The Greek word there is apocalypsis. Apocalypsis essentially means unveiling something which is veiled. Unveiling something which is veiled. Something which is veiled is called kekalumenon. Kekalumenon. So, when something is kekalumenon, it's already there. It is already there, but when you unveil it, that is apocalypsis. Unveiling something that is hidden, or that. Okay? There are three primary aspects of apocalypse concerning the return of Christ. Three primary aspects of apocalypse concerning the return of Christ. Look with me, please, to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 to 18. Having therefore such a hope, we use great boldness in our speech, and are not as Moses, who used to put a veil over his face, that the sons of Israel might not look intently at the end of what was fading away. But their minds were hardened, for until this very day, at the reading of the Old Covenant, the same veil remains unlifted, because it is removed in the Messiah. But to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their heart, that's the Jews. But whenever a man turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Again, the law teaches through the example of Israel and the Jews about the fallen nature of man, who is spiritually blind. That is why we say, I saw the light, or we came to the light. Okay. This word, anakulupomenon, is the unveiling of the gospel to the Jews. One of the apocalypses of the last days is what we read about in Romans chapter 11. The blindness that is over the Jews to the Torah, that has been over their hearts for centuries, begins to become removed. When you see the natural branches being grafted in again, when you see Jewish people in significant numbers turning back to Christ as the Jewish Messiah, that is a sign that the apocalypse is happening. The meaning of the law of the Torah, they begin to see, it points to their Messiah, Yeshua. And in the last days, God removes the veil from their hearts, from their eyes. Now again, the Jews are a microcosm of the human condition. All man is fallen, all man is blind, but the Jews are the object lesson through which God teaches about human blindness and human inability to save himself. The apocalypse is lifted up. Nearly 20 years ago, the American College of Rabbis said more Jews have accepted Christ as the Messiah in the last 18 years, than in the last 18 centuries. That was nearly 20 years ago. That was nearly 20 years ago. That was in the early 1980s. Okay. More Jews have accepted Christ in the last 18 years than in the last 18 centuries. That was nearly 20 years ago. And a lot more have accepted Christ since then. Everywhere I go, South Africa, Russia, Israel, the United States, Australia, you see more and more Jews believing. My children are born in Israel. They witness to their parents who are Holocaust survivors. It's not just the Jews are coming to Christ, but it's the children and grandchildren of the greatest Jewish bloodbath in history who are returning to him. This is Romans 11. The natural branch is being grafted in again, the time of the Gentiles drawing to a close. Again, the clock getting ready to begin ticking again. The apocalypse, there's an unveiling of the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, the Tanakh. That is one aspect. The second aspect is one we looked at in the book of Daniel. What John saw and what Daniel saw were essentially the same things. Essentially, Revelation and Daniel go together. But what John saw was sealed up. What Daniel saw was sealed up and now begins to be explained by John. Turn again, please, to the book of book of Daniel, chapter 12. Daniel, chapter 12. 4, as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. The apocalyptic literature of the Bible. And remember, apocalyptic is not just Revelation. We had Old Testament apocalyptic in the second half of Isaiah, in the second half of Zechariah, in most of Ezekiel, and in most of Daniel. You have Hebrew apocalyptic. You also have Greek apocalyptic. Greek apocalyptic. In the intertestamental period between Malachi and John the Baptist, Yochanan HaMatbil, John the Baptist, you had a fusion of Hebrew and Greek literary forms. First of all, you had the Septuagint, the Old Testament translated into Greek. But then you also had the apocryphal history books, especially 1st and 2nd Enoch. You begin to see how Jewish apocalyptic is put into the Greek language in 1st and 2nd Enoch. And 1st and 2nd Enoch is a literary background to understanding Revelation. A literary background, not a theological one, but a literary one, and a historical one of some benefit. So you already have apocalyptic. It's always there. But Daniel is told to seal it up until the appointed time. Notice, there is no new truth. There is no new doctrine. There is no new revelation. But there is a clearer understanding of what is already in there. Martin Luther basically demeaned the book of Revelation. He didn't consider it worth reading. It wasn't for his time, in a sense. As we get closer to the return of Jesus, the apocalypse happens. Something that's there is unveiled. It gets clearer and clearer. The veil is lifted higher and higher. It makes more and more sense. There are things happening in the world now that evangelical preachers warned would happen 50 years ago. There are things now that I personally, and I'm certainly not the only one, there's things now I understand about the book of Revelation that I didn't understand 6 months ago. In fact, there's things I understand now that I didn't understand 1 month ago. It gets clearer and clearer and clearer to those who seek Jesus. No new revelation, no new doctrine. Look out for anybody who tells you otherwise. But a clearer understanding of what is already in there, absolutely. Now this becomes very important for the following reason. Again, the rapture is being denied, even taught against, even being called satanic in some circles. One of the bogus arguments made against the doctrine of the rapture is this. People have only been talking about it for the last 150 years. First of all, that is not true. It was believed in the early church. That's not true. But the fact that something has only been emphasized for the last 150 years does not by any means mean it is bogus. It may mean it's bogus, or it may simply mean what was always there is now being unveiled. You could make just as much of an argument that that's proof that it is happening, that we didn't used to understand it. Now it's becoming clearer as the veil goes up. Okay? It's not a good argument, but it is an argument. Now let's take this a bit further. The ultimate apocalypse is this. Revelation 13, counting the number of the beast. But let's turn to 2 Thessalonians, please. 2 Thessalonians. Chapter 2. Speaking of the Antichrist, verse 6, and you know what restrains him now, so that in his time he may be revealed. Apocalypsis. Apocalypsis. The ultimate mystery. Who is this guy? Apocalypsis. Okay? That's the ultimate meaning. Now, to understand this, we can look, for instance, at Luke chapter 12, verse 2. we put the OHP back on, please? There is nothing covered up that will not be revealed, and hidden that will not be made known. Now, there's a lot of general meaning in this verse, but that word is a very interesting one. That word tells us is this word, apokolupthesitoi. Something that is hidden that will be made known. The elect, the true elect, the faithful, will understand what these things, the deepest things of Scripture, mean. There'll be no mistakes. There'll be no controversy. The elect will know what these things mean. Jesus made the following statement. When a scribe becomes a disciple, he brings things out of the treasury, old and new. When a scribe becomes a disciple, it's possible to be a scribe without being a disciple. The scribes were the sofrim, from the Hebrew infinitive of the Hebrew word lispor. Literally, they counted the letters of a text. They were academics. They were concerned with an academic knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures. These were the scribes. Now, Jesus spoke of scribes sometimes quite negatively. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Other places, he spoke of them positively. I will send you prophets and scribes. A scribe itself is objective. An academic, a theologian is objective. He could be a religious hypocrite who's totally blind or willfully blind, or he can be somebody who God will speak through. The Bible never demeans scholarship. But it's when a scribe becomes a disciple. I know people that would have PhDs from the best universities in the world in theology, and they're not even saved. They're not even saved. They're not even Christians. And people like this in Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard and Princeton and in Jerusalem, they're not even saved. However, if a scholar becomes a disciple, not a Christian, but a disciple, a committed Christian, he will bring from the treasury things old and things new. Things old are the doctrines we all know. Things new is this, apocalypsis, unveiling the things that are always in God's word but not understood. Just because you hear something new doesn't mean it's new. It was always in the treasury. You understand? The Bible never demeans scholarship. There's good scribes and there's bad scribes. There's good scholars and there's bad scholars. But it's the scribe who will bring things out old and new. With this in view, let's look at the different positions concerning the rapture of the church. Turn with me, please, to 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 10. Wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, that is Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. And also, chapter 5, verse 9. Chapter 5, verse 9 of 1 Corinthians. For God has not destined us for wrath. That word is orges, wrath, orges. On these verses and other similar ones, people base the pre-tribulation position. There is another verse, not using the word orges, using a different Greek word that pre-tribulationists also draw on. Turn to Revelation chapter 3, verse 10, please. Because you've kept the word of my perseverance, I'll also keep you from the hour of testing. That word is in Greek this. Peres mon. Peresmon. Orges is wrath. Peresmon is testing as in an ordeal. Testing as in an ordeal. Okay? The pre-trib people will look upon these verses, these will be the prime ones, and say, this proves that the rapture is imminent and is before the tribulation, by which they normally mean the 70th week of Daniel, the last 7 lunar years of history. That is the pre-tribulation view. Turn now to 2 Thessalonians, or let's look at Matthew 24 first of all. Matthew 24, 21 and 22. Matthew 24, 21 and 22. Then there will be a great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world, until now nor ever shall, and unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days would be cut short. Also, verses 29 to 31. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky. The powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Okay? This word for tribulation is a different word again. This word is thlipsis. Examples, Matthew 24, 21 to 23, and also 29 to 31. Also, please, let's look to 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 to 8. Now we request you, brethren, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him. That word for our gathering together to him is this word, episunagage. We get the word synagogue. Epi means around. Episunagage are gathering around to him. Harpezo and episunagage are the two general terms for rapture. One is episunagage, are gathering together to be with him. Okay? That you may not be quickly shaken from your composure or be disturbed either by a spirit or a message or a letter, as if from us, as if to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasia, that is the falling away, comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, that is in the character of Antiochus, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Do you not remember that while I was with you, I was telling you these things? And you know what restrains him now, so that in his time he may be revealed. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. And then that lawless one will be revealed, Apocalypse, whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. So the day of the Lord won't come, and our gathering together won't happen until we can identify the Antichrist. Thus, the post-trib people emphasize these scriptures. Okay? They would emphasize these scriptures, pre-trib and post-trib. Then we have another family of subscribers. They don't have any verse or passage that supports their belief. They have to engage not in exegesis, but in eisegesis. That is, they don't draw something out of the scriptures that's in there. They read something into the text that it doesn't say. In exegesis, you take out of God's word what's there. In eisegesis, you read something into it. These people point out that both Daniel and Revelation divide the last 7 years of history into two halves. 2 times a time and a half time, 1,260 days. And they say that the Lord will come at the halfway point of this great tribulation. These people are called mid-trib. I know others will say they're pan-trib. At the end, it all pans out. Mid-trib is the most implausible for 2 reasons. One, there is no specific passage supporting that conclusion. Its other problem, and its more serious problem, is you will not know the day or the hour. So if you could calculate a treaty that the Antichrist makes with Israel, and again, there may be several, we don't know which one it is, but then you just count 3.5 years, you would be able to know when the Lord is coming. And since we can't know what day the Lord is coming, well, it doesn't work. This is at least the classical mid-trib position. It's the least plausible. So far, the dispute or the argument is between the pre-trib and the post-trib. However, the early Christians and the first dispensationalists of the 19th century were neither pre-trib nor post-trib, and they certainly weren't mid-trib. These people were intra-trib. They believed it happened specifically during the second half. Many intra-trib people would say, you can't be sure that the Great Tribulation is 7 years. You can only be sure the Great Tribulation is the second half, because the second half is obviously much worse than the first. But also, it would appear that the Antichrist will attempt to counterfeit the millennium in the first half. So we can only be sure that the Great Tribulation is the second half. Many of them would say that, and they do have an argument. However, the intra-trib people will say that the rapture and resurrection, which are the same event, take place at a fairly early point during the second half. And we'll get more specific than that as we move on. Intra-trib is what the early Christians believed. In more recent years, there has been a variation on intra-trib, which is erroneous. There are people introducing ideas that are crazy into the intra-trib point of view. One of these is now dead. He said that Adolf Hitler is the Antichrist and he's going to be reincarnated. Nut job stuff. These people are called pre-wrath. Pre-wrath is a corruption of intra-trib. Pre-wrath is a corruption of intra-trib. The pre-wrath people say that he who restrains Satan, preventing the Antichrist from coming, is an angel. In fact, it is not an angel. It is who the post-trib and pre-trib people say it is. It's the Holy Spirit. Okay? It's the Holy Spirit who restrains. The pre-wrath people corrupt the intra-trib perspective or point of view. Now again, the intra-trib was what the early Christians were. The early Christians were. So we first look at what the New Testament teaches. The next thing we go to is, what did the early church believe? The patristic writers, particularly the pre-Nicene, before the Council of Nicaea, before the time of Constantine, what did the church fathers, who were closest to the apostles, say the apostles believed? And we trace lineages. For instance, we know that Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp was a disciple of John. So Polycarp got his doctrines from the apostles in Ephesus and passed them on to Irenaeus. Others like Papias, Hippolytus, these are the more important ones, also to a degree Justin Martyr. The closest they were to the apostles, the better they tended to be and the more credible a source. The further you get away from the apostles, the less credible, the less of a source authority the patristic writers become, particularly after Augustine. But let's look at what the earliest Christians after the apostles believed. There was an early Christian document that probably goes back to the 1st century, called in Greek the Didache. The Didache. The Didache comes from the Greek word didaskin, meaning teaching. And in the early councils of the church, there was even a question: is the Didache canonical? Some people believed it could possibly have apostolic authority and should have been included in the canons of the early church. I personally think they were right in saying it was not canonical, but even the ones who said it wasn't canonical admitted that it was doctrinally and historically true and was a reflection of the apostles' teaching. The Didache, and there's also something called the Shepherd of Hermes, but more importantly, the Didache is the single most important document we have from the early church explaining doctrine that's not in the New Testament. It's the closest you can get to the New Testament by attestation without being part of the New Testament canon. Very early point in history. The Didache supported the view that the rapture and resurrection would not happen until the faithful knew who the Antichrist was. Now let's go a bit further with this. Practically every single pre-Nicene father, every one of the patristics were categorically premillennial. The early church all believed there would be a literal millennial reign of Jesus on the earth. Postmillennialism and amillennialism are absolute nonsense. They were invented by incipient Roman Catholicism and really began to gain momentum and status in the 4th century. I won't go into it now. Many of you are familiar with our tape, One Messiah, Two Comings. In the Hebrew faith, there are two pictures of the Messiah, Hamashiach ben Yosef and Hamashiach ben David, Messiah son of Joseph and Messiah son of David. The Messiah son of David is that Messiah prefigured by King David, who would reign from Jerusalem. The reign of King David is a type, a figure of the millennium, where there was peace on every side, And David was reigning from Jerusalem, and all the enemies of God were subdued. And the reign of David and Solomon is a picture of the millennial reign of the Messiah. Okay? Now that's one picture of the Messiah in Judaism, the Messiah, son of David, Hamashiach ben David. The other is Hamashiach ben Yosef, Messiah, who's son of Joseph, prefigured by Joseph in the book of Genesis. Joseph was betrayed by his Jewish brothers into the hands of Gentiles. God took that betrayal and turned it around and made it a way for all Israel and all the world to be saved. So Jesus was betrayed by his Jewish brothers into the hands of Gentiles. God took the betrayal and turned it around, making it a way for all Israel and all the world to be saved. Joseph was condemned with two criminals, and as Joseph prophesied, one would live and one died. And so Yeshua, Jesus, was crucified with two criminals, and as he prophesied, one lived and one died. Joseph went from a place of condemnation to a place of exaltation in a single day. And upon exaltation, every knee had to bow to him, and he took a Gentile bride. And so Jesus goes from a place of condemnation to a place of exaltation in a single day. Every knee shall bow and tongue confess, and in figure he takes a Gentile bride, the church. Okay? Joseph was the beloved of his father, and they bought Joseph's cloak to prove he wasn't in the pit. Jesus was the beloved of his father, and they bought his shroud to prove he wasn't in the tomb. Joseph was betrayed by his brother Yehuda, Judas, for 20 pieces of silver. And of course, after inflation, Jesus was betrayed by Yehuda, Judas, for 30 pieces of silver. And it goes on and on and on like this. But Joseph's brothers, the Jews, they didn't recognize him at the first coming. They recognized him at the second, and they wept bitterly. And so Jesus' brothers, the Jews, Zechariah 12, don't recognize him at the first coming, but at the second, and so they weep bitterly. In order to be the Christ, in order for Jesus to be the Christ, Yeshua must be the Mashiach. If Jesus is not the Messiah of the Jews, he cannot be the Christ of the church. It means the same thing. But in order to be the Messiah of the Jews, he had to fulfill all the Old Testament prophecies, both the son of Joseph prophecies and the son of David prophecies. In fact, Jesus has not fulfilled all of the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. He has only partially fulfilled the son of David prophecies. In his first coming, he fulfills the son of Joseph prophecies, not the son of David ones. This is what the apostles asked him. Lord, is at this time you're restoring the kingdom? We know you're the son of Joseph. When are you going to restore the kingdom and be like David? That's his purpose in his second coming, to fulfill the son of David prophecies, Hamashiach ben David. If there is no millennium, he cannot fulfill those prophecies, and therefore he cannot be the Messiah. And if he's not the Messiah, he's not the Christ. If there's no millennium, Jesus is not the Christ. Forget all this ridiculous post-millennial and amillennial hogwash. It comes from absolute Constantinization of the church. It comes from Constantine and Augustine. It doesn't come from the Bible. The early Christians didn't believe that nonsense. It's not biblical. It has no historical or scriptural validity whatsoever. It's total nonsense. If you're in a church that's teaching amillennialism or postmillennialism, they don't know what they're talking about. Now let's understand this. They all believed it would be a millennium. All. The first document in the early church that we have any record of was not from the early church like the Didache, as in 1st century, 2nd century. It was from the 6th century. The first document we have that was not pre-trib was 6th century. This is called Pseudo-Ephraim, named after an Eastern church father in Syria, Ephraim. We have 4 Latin manuscripts of it. 3 are attributed to Ephraim. 3 are attributed to Ephraim. 1 is attributed to someone called Isidore of Seville in Spain, who lived in the 6th century. Ephraim, this Ephraim, lived in the 4th century in Syria. But it's a pseudo-Ephraim, meaning Ephraim didn't write it. The scholars know he didn't write it. It's not the right age, it's not the right language, not the right syntax, not the right style. He didn't write it. It's attributed to him. This document has a lot of crazy things in it. And it is not premillennial. Every other eschatology of the early church was premillennial. This is 6th century. Isidore was one of the last Latin fathers. This is way at the very end of the post-apostolic era. Much older than the Didache. It's not premillennial, and it says some very strange things. This is the only ancient manuscript that is not intra-tribulational. This view is the one of the early church. The earliest dispensationalists had the same view. Dispensationalism is identified with a particular church that had many good points. A few bad ones, but mostly good ones. The Plymouth Brethren. They're the most learned of the followers, the founders of the Plymouth Brethren. The most learned was a Greek scholar called Dr. Samuel Tregelles. He was a Brethren Greek scholar. He was by far the most educated of the founders of dispensationalism in the modern sense, more learned than Schofield. He had this view, this intra-tribulational view. But somebody else came along who was Brethren, but who went off his rocker. His name was John Nelson Darby. Darby, for all kinds of reasons, turned against the other brethren. He turned against people like Hudson Taylor and George Mueller. And those who followed Darby, John Nelson Darby, founded a virtual cult called the Exclusive Brethren, the Closed Brethren. They're into this bunker mentality thing. We knew a woman who was 34 years in the Closed Brethren, wasn't even a Christian and didn't know it. John Nelson Darby was the one who began to propagate or equate pre-trib with dispensationalism. But the original dispensationalists didn't do that. The idea that there would be a difference between the rapture and revelation of Christ was something put together by someone alleged to be Roman Catholic called Lacunza. But the first really well-documented idea of a pre-trib rapture in modern times began at about 1830. 1830. Before that, nobody talked about it. Now again, because somebody never talked about something doesn't mean it's right or wrong. The question is, was he a scribe who was a disciple, and was he bringing things out of the treasury that were old and new? Well, as we look at what the pre-trib people say, they've got a problem. We go back to the first plate, please. This is their problem. Their problem is they assume that orges and thlipsis are synonymous terms. Or even going further, that paresmos, orges, and thlipsis are synonymous terms. Orges, paresmos, and thlipsis are not synonymous terms. Thlipsis means tribulation. That's the main meaning, the Great Tribulation, thlipsis. Orges means wrath. Wrath. Faithful Christians will not experience the wrath of God. Faithful Christians will never experience the wrath of God. But they have always experienced tribulation. Jesus said, you will have tribulation in the world. Now, there is a specific meaning of the Great Tribulation for the Jews. More about that tonight. But let's understand this. Orges means wrath. The wrath of God is one thing. The wrath of Satan is another. As the post-trib people correctly point out, there is nothing in the syntax, grammar, or construction of the Greek text of 2 Thessalonians that would lead us to believe anything other than what it says on face value in a good English translation. That the rapture, resurrection, will not take place until we know who the Antichrist is. Let he who has wisdom count the number of the beast. Jesus is our wisdom. If we're not here, the people with wisdom aren't here, who's going to know who he is? Makes no sense. Why do the scriptures go to so many lengths in telling people how to identify him? Now that is a possible conference topic for next year, understanding the Antichrist from a Judeo-Christian perspective. That may be our conference next year. We're still seeking the Lord about it and talking to people. This episynagoge won't happen until we know who this guy is. Here, the post-trib people are absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. But we will not experience the wrath of God. Here, the pre-trib people are correct. They're both right in what they say. They're wrong in what they fail to say. The answer is what the early Christians believed. The intra-trib rapture. It comes during that period. Again, we talked about how people reinterpret their freedom and affluence in light of their own experience. Just because it's alien to our experience to be persecuted, we think it can't happen. Well, it's going to happen. The people who think it won't happen are the ones who are going to be the first to fall away. Remember when Jesus said, many will fall away and betray one another. If people are being told, you're a king's kid, God wants you rich, you don't have to suffer. What's going to happen when they do suffer? You cannot believe the faith of Hebrews 11 and the faith of the faith prosperity preachers. You can either believe Copeland and Hagen and these guys, or you can believe Jesus Christ, but you can't believe both. You either believe faith in Jesus as per Romans 11, or you believe faith in faith as per Kenneth Hagin, but you can't believe both. You either believe the Bible or you believe Hagen and Copeland, but you can't believe both. You can be a disciple of Christ or you can be a disciple of Mammon, but you can't follow both. No man can serve two masters. So when people are told they don't have to suffer, they're a king's kid, what's going to happen when persecution comes? Many will fall away and betray one another. Let me tell you who is going to fall away and betray you and your children tomorrow. The Christians who will fall away and betray you and your family tomorrow are the ones listening to Kenneth Copeland, Kenneth Hagin, Marilyn Hickey, Betty Hinn, etc. today. That's who's going to sell you down the river tomorrow. Amen. Make no mistake about it. They'll cut your throat in a minute. Because their hope is in this world. When the scriptures speak of Antichrist, it prefaces it by saying, love not the world. Their churches are encouraging them to love the world. Now, let's go further. Let's begin to understand about apocalypsis. Let's see what happened when things begin to become unveiled. We have to understand the distinction between the way the Western Gentile church understands prophecy and the way the Bible teaches prophecy. The writers of the Bible, both Testaments, were ancient Jews. Now we have something called the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran texts. When you look at the way the New Testament handles the Old Testament in light of the Dead Sea Scrolls, one thing becomes blatantly obvious. The writers of the New Testament used Jewish midrash. They used a different manner of hermeneutics than the Western Church. Now, this is a broad subject in itself. You can get one of my books if you're so inclined. However, let's begin with eschatology, with end times prophecy. If you ever went to a theological seminary, I did, you would be taught that there are 4 ways to understand apocalyptic literature. 4 basic approaches. You'd be taught that there is preterism, historicism, poeticism, and futurism. There are 2 basic approaches when they educate ministers. If you went to a very denominational school, they would tend to emphasize which of these that denomination supports. For instance, Lutherans, because of Luther's influence, scarcely consider the book of Revelation to be canonical. So it's only poetry to encourage the church. Lutherans would tend to emphasize polemicism. Liberals would emphasize preterism. Reformed, real Calvinistic seminaries would emphasize historicism. A good seminary would teach all 4 and say, make up your own mind. Well, they've all got it wrong. Not that I'm trying to be arrogant. I'm just saying, let's look at how the apostles and early Christians would have looked at this. Let's begin with preterism. Preterism means pre. It already happened. There are 2 kinds of preterism in looking at biblical prophecy. The first kind of preterism are the bad guys. They're the liberal higher critics. These people are basically Darwinists, that the texts evolved. A liberal would say something like, we can't be sure there's a God, and even if there is a God, we can't be sure he knows the future. And even if he does know the future, he certainly wouldn't tell it to Isaiah. So therefore, in Isaiah chapter 42, chapter 44, where Isaiah predicts that a Persian king would come along 200 years later named Cyrus, Kirush, and send the Jews back to Israel, well, that proves that Isaiah didn't write Isaiah, because he couldn't have known the future, let alone the name of somebody who would become king 200 years later. To them, it's prima facie evidence Isaiah didn't write Isaiah, so therefore somebody else called Deutero-Isaiah wrote it. These people say that when you see a predictive prophecy in the Bible that we know happened, it is what they call an ex latitudinia interpolation. In other words, somebody came along and took something that already happened and wrote it to make it look like it was a prophecy that was written before the fact, but it was post facto. They made it something that happened, try to make it look like it was predicted after it already happened. Those are the bad preterists. Well, actually, there's no good preterists. There's not bad ones and good ones. There's bad ones and worse ones. Those are the worst ones. Now I'll tell you the bad ones. The bad ones are Reconstructionists, Calvinists, Theonomists. The main ones today, well, he died 3 months ago, terrible loss, was Rousas Rushdoony, Greg Bonson, Gary DeMar, David Chilton, Gary North. They have influenced hyper-charismatics like Rick Godwin, the whole Manifest Son's Kingdom Now stuff. Those preterists say, well, it all happened in 70 AD. Matthew 24 all happened in 70 AD. The book of Revelation, that's not written at the end of the first century. It was written in the middle of the first century, and it already happened. It has no future meaning. This stuff has no meaning for us. Now the church is going to go forth and triumph and conquer the world before Christ comes. It already happened. Don't worry about the future. That's preterism. Now this is crazy. Did Jesus separate the sheep from goats in 70 AD? Did he give people their eternal reward based on what they did with their talents in 70 AD? Of course they didn't. He didn't. But that's what preterism says. It already happened. The next is historicism. The reformers were historicists. They would say something like, well, there's many antichrists. The antichrist is not so much a person, there's many antichrists, it's an institution. Specifically the papacy, the popes, the Vatican, etc. Well, the Vatican came a bit later around then. So every pope is the antichrist. This is what we believe by things like Presbyterians and Reformed churches, okay? That, yeah, it's a prophecy, it's a prediction, but it's not something specific, it's something dynamic, historical. In every generation, there's an antichrist. There's one of the many antichrists. Poemicism is, from the Greek word poeo, to do, sounds like poetry, that's what it means. Oh, this is simply poetry to encourage the church during times of persecution to remind us we have a future glory with Jesus. That's all it is poetry. We shouldn't look for any specific predictive element in it. It's simply poems to encourage us when we're being persecuted. That's what poemicists say. Finally, there's Hal Lindsey, Barry Smith, and company. Futurists. It's still something in the future that's going to happen. So the Western Protestant world would say you can either be a preterist, a historicist, a poemicist, or a futurist. That is because they have a Western Hellenistic worldview. I'll come back to this in a moment. We have three basic worldviews. You have an Eastern worldview from the Orient. The Eastern worldview has a circular view of history. There are 4 seasons. It goes night to day to night, night to day, summer, autumn, winter, spring, summer, autumn, winter, spring. It is a circular worldview. Hinduism is a classical example of this. This Eastern worldview existed in the ancient Near East. The Canaanites had a resurrection myth about Baal. Baal rose from the dead, the pagan god, every spring. This is the Eastern worldview. It is circular. The Western worldview is different. It is Hellenistic. It is Greek. The Western worldview says the following. There is Alpha and Omega. History is linear. We are progressing towards the Omega point. History is going forward, not in a circle. However, the ancient Hebrew worldview was neither Eastern nor was it Western. It was neither linear nor was it circular. God put the Jews in the land of Israel for the following reason. We're told in Isaiah it's the center of the earth. It is where Europe, Africa, and Asia converge. Remember, in those days, the Near East, Turkey, and that was part of Europe, part of the Greek world. So the gospel could spread in 4 directions: north, south, east, and west. He put them at the center where east met west. Caravan routes, the Phoenician trade routes, they all converged there. Via Maris, all these Roman roads and so on. Via Damascus. He puts them there. The book of Acts only traces the spread of the gospel in one direction, north, to the European world. Again, if you were to begin at Aleppo and Antioch, that would be the Greek world. It would be the Greco-Roman civilization up through Turkey, the Roman province of Asia. Eastern Turkey would have been Greek-speaking. It would have been Indo-European. And then the gospel goes to Greece and then to Rome, to Italy. The book of Acts traces one direction. It doesn't trace the other 3. For the following reason: it shows the hardest path. Okay? The hardest path. Rome was the 4th beast of Daniel. It was the hardest path with the most resistance. When the gospel went east, although there was opposition and persecution, the eastern peoples, civilizations, accepted it. The Armenian Empire was Christianized long before the Roman Empire. Okay? Now the Armenian Orthodox Church, Catholic Church, is off the wall in its doctrines, but they have a very ancient heritage. They Christianized long before the West. The idea of the Roman Catholic Church being the oldest is absurd. Secondly, we know that Black Africa goes back all the way to the Ethiopian eunuch. The Coptic churches of Ethiopia, the Sudan, what the Bible would have called the Hamitic peoples, accepted the gospel in large numbers. Again, the Coptic church believes things that are unbiblical today, but it has a very ancient heritage going back centuries and centuries and centuries. As the gospel went south, Black Africa accepted it. As the gospel went west across the north of Africa, the Berbers accepted it. The Berbers had the most Christians of the Roman Empire and were brutally persecuted. Brutally, they faced brutal bloodbaths. Cyprian of Carthage and all this stuff, they were brutal bloodbaths in North Africa. So the gospel spread quickly to the west, quickly to the south, and quickly to the east. It was north to the European world where there was the most resistance. And the book of Acts only shows the path of most resistance. Okay? Now understand, God put them there because they had a message that was for both east and west, north and south. The Hebrew worldview didn't have an Alpha and Omega, of course. It had an Aleph and a Tav, and they would have went right to left. It was not circular like the Hindu world or the Eastern world, and it was not linear like the Western world. What it was this. Well, for the sake of not confusing anyone, we use Alpha and Omega. It was cyclical. Like the Greek world, it was progressing towards an eschaton, towards an ultimate event, which was the parousia, the return of Christ. Like the Greek world, it was progressive. But like the Eastern world, it was also circular. History was cyclical. Now, to understand prophecy, you've got to understand that. To the Western world, it's either preterism, historicism, Hellenism, or futurism. To the Jewish believers who wrote the New Testament, it was all 4 simultaneously. Let me explain. Turn to Matthew 24, please. Verse 15, when you see Hashikutz HaMeshomem, the abomination of desolation, much meaning in that. It's an Aramaic term, not a Hebrew one. Now we know from the book of Daniel that the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel had already happened 160 years before the time of Jesus. It already happened. And Jesus knew it happened. He himself was celebrating Hanukkah, the Jewish feast of rededication of the temple, the Feast of the Maccabees. He was celebrating Hanukkah in John 10. Jesus knew it happened. Yet he says it's going to happen again. Jesus takes something that already happened and makes a prophecy out of it. He uses preterism. Not in the way that liberals use it, not in the way that Kingdom Now or Calvinistic Reconstructionists use it, but he certainly uses preterism. He takes something which already happened and makes a prophecy. But now the abomination of desolations. When the Apostle James was martyred, a cousin of Jesus became the senior pastor, as it were, of the church in Jerusalem. His name was Simeon. And remembering what Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, he led the believers out of Jerusalem to a place called Pella, not Petra, but Pella. And Josephus, in Wars of the Jews, he records how the Roman armies of Titus inexplicably withdrew briefly, and the believers went out, and then they re-encircled the city. Now, what happened in that city after the believers were removed is a major type of the Great Tribulation. The women began eating their babies, and it replayed what happened in the last days of the first temple period with Jeremiah. What happened in Jerusalem in 70 AD is a microcosm of what the Great Tribulation will be like, if you want to read Josephus. Okay? The believers come out. They think that was the rapture. Okay? And when the Romans destroyed the temple, stones thrown down upon another, they put pagan ensigns on the Temple Mount where the holies of holies had been, symbolizing political dominion by imperial Rome over the house of God. And they begin worshiping these ensigns. And the early Christians find out about this, and they say, that's the abomination of desolations. In the 2nd century, the Emperor Hadrian, same one who built the wall across the north of England, he levels Jerusalem and built a pagan city called Arelina Capitolina with the temple of Jupiter. Jupiter was simply what the Romans called Zeus. Same as Antiochus was Zeus to Antiochus. The Romans, it was Jupiter, same guy. Identifying with the biggest planet, who was the biggest god, the head honcho. Well, Temple of Jupiter, that's another abomination. In the 4th century, Julian the Apostate, Constantine's nephew, attempts to repaganize the Roman Empire. And he wants to reverse the prophecy of Jesus in Matthew 24 about the stones being thrown down. So he tries to build a temple. And all these mysterious fires happen. That's another abomination. Today is the Dome of the Rock, the Mosque of Omar. If you come with us to Israel in April, we'll show you. There's an inscription from the Koran on the periphery of it. God has no son. Now we're told in 1 John, that which denies the father-son relationship is Antichrist. I was appalled, although not surprised, to learn that last month Youth with a Mission announced that it's going to put its converts back into Hindu temples and back into mosques and cooperate with Hindu holy men. But YWAM is going to put converts back into mosques, which says God has no son. Youth with a Mission, Youth Without Minds. I hate that organization. I hope it drops dead. God has no son. That's what it says on the Mosque of Omar. Another abomination. Historicism is true. Multiple fulfillments. Preterism is true. Historicism is true. Again, it's cyclical. To the Western mind, prophecy is a prediction and a fulfillment. To the ancient Hebrew mind, it's a pattern. But each fulfillment is a type, a foreshadow of the ultimate one. Many antichrists, each one of them is a type, a shadow of the ultimate. Well, polemicism. During the persecution of the Emperor Domitian, John is the last apostle alive. He's very old, particularly by the standards of the ancient world. He's on Patmos. Nero killed Peter and Paul. The other apostles are all dead. John's the only one left. The early Christians thought the Lord was going to come in their lifetime. At least they expected he would likely do that. And they needed to be encouraged during a time of persecution when they were facing wholesale despair. Where is Jesus? Poemicism is true. He gives them something to assure them about their eternal destiny. That's why there's a special blessing on reading the book of Revelation. It's the only book of the Bible with a specific blessing on those who read it. It encourages us about the future. But then there's futurism. He has still to separate the sheep from goats. He is still to return to raise the dead and establish his messianic kingdom. He is still to give people their rewards based on what they did with their talents. To the Hebrew mind, all four are true. What you see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they took past events and they saw them as present ones, the same as Jesus did with the abomination of desolation. Exactly, Midrash would have no problem explaining this. All four are true. It's not a prediction and a fulfillment, it's a pattern. Prophecy is a pattern. Now, with this in view, let's begin to apply some of this to the book of Revelation. But first, turn with me, please, to the book of Joshua. Chapter 6. We all know the story of Joshua. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Heard about Gideon's army, and you heard about your man Saul, but you ain't heard nothing like Joshua. He's the greatest of them all. Now, 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 Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. We all know that song, but it's not about a past event. It is about a coming event. Let's read it. Now Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. No one went out, no one came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, remember Joshua and Jesus is the same name. Jesus, Yeshua, is simply the way they said Yehoshua after the Babylonian captivity. And the Lord said to Joshua, see, I've given Jericho into your hand with its king and the valiant warriors. You shall march around the city, all the men of war circling the city. You shall do it 6 days. Also 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And it shall be that when they make the long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will go flat, and the people will go up every man straight, etc. Now you all know the story about the 2 spies and Rahab and the rest of it. Turn please to the book of Revelation, chapter 8. You won't get this in a commentary because it's written by people with a linear Hellenistic worldview. He broke the 7th seal. And there was silence in heaven for a half hour. For me, this may be the most mysterious verse in the Bible. We have 2 Greek words for time. We have chronos and kairos. How do you apply time to eternity, which is by definition outside of time? Another matter, but let's look. What you have here is a numerical pattern. Joshua, Revelation. Joshua and Revelation. In Joshua, they had to march around 7 days. But the 7th day, they had to do it 7 times. So you have 7, but from the 7th 7, you have a subset of 7. Then when they did it, they had to be silent, quiet. Then these 2 spies go in and rescue a Gentile woman, Rahab, and her family. But when they blow the last trumpet, this city has been given to us by the Lord. Now this idea of trumpet connects with the trumpet in Thessalonians, the trumpet of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, but it is all fulfilling the typology of the Hebrew Feast of Trumpets, which the rabbis have corrupted into Rosh Hashanah. But that's not its original meaning. Again, I can't go into that. You have to get our tapes on the typology of the Hebrew calendar to understand what I mean. Jesus fulfills the spring holidays of the Jews in his first coming. He fulfills the autumn holidays, beginning with trumpets in his return. Now, if you read Revelation, what happens? You got 7 seals. But out of the 7th seal is a subset of 7 trumpets. And there is silence. And they blow the last trumpet, only instead of this city has been given to us by the Lord, it's this world has become the kingdom of our God and his Messiah. Somehow, those 2 spies who rescue Rahab prefigure the ministry of the 2 witnesses in Revelation. There are many, many people in the Bible who teach about those 2 witnesses. They're in Zechariah 4. They're the 2 angels who rescued Lot. They're Yeshua and Zerubbabel in Zechariah. It's not just Moses and Elijah or Moses and John or Moses and Enoch or whatever. There are many, many, many people in the Bible who teach about those 2 witnesses, and these 2 spies are among them. Who they are is a question. But realize, to understand that, to answer that question definitively and decisively, you have to understand everybody in the Bible who teaches about them, not just Moses and Elijah or Moses and Enoch. So a Jewish believer, a Messianic Jew in the 1st century, he would have read Revelation 8, 9, 10, 11. You know what he would have said? This is a midrash on Joshua chapter 6. You understand? Cyclical, pattern. God declares the end from the beginning, Alpha and Omega. What he's going to do is what he did do. We have to go back and interpret the scriptures from a Judeo-Christian perspective as a Jewish book. Now again, there are many, many, many things in the Bible that have to be understood this way. The judgments on Egypt are replayed, recapitulated in Revelation. The Choshek, the Dam, the blood, the dark. Again, Pharaoh's magicians counterfeiting the miracles of Moses and Aaron. That's Antichrist and false prophet all over again. Let's understand the pattern. Turn to 1 Corinthians 10, please. I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. The exodus of the Jews is a picture of our salvation, isn't it? Egypt is a figure of the world. Pharaoh, whom the Egyptians deified, is a figure of Satan, the god of the world. As Moses made a covenant with the blood of the Lamb, sprinkled it on God's people, and took them out of Egypt through the Red Sea into the Promised Land, is a picture of the way Jesus brings us out of the world through baptism into heaven. Okay? It's a picture of salvation. But it doesn't begin with the Exodus or with the gospel. It begins with Abraham, the father of all who believed. In a famine, Abraham goes into Egypt, doesn't he? God judges Pharaoh. Abraham's descendants, 420 years later, thereabout, do the same thing. When God judges Pharaoh and brings Abraham out of Egypt to the Promised Land, 420 years later, God judges Pharaoh, a wicked king, and Abraham's physical descendants, the Hebrews, come out of Egypt. What happens to Abraham happens to his descendants. Well, Jesus is the seed of Abraham. Look at Matthew chapter 2. Verse 15, a formula citation, out of Egypt that I call my son. That quotes from the book of Hosea, chapter 11, verse 1, and applies it to Jesus. Now, there's a problem with Western Protestant grammatical historical exegesis. If I were to read Hosea 11:1, it says, when Israel was a youth, I loved him. Out of Egypt, I called my son. Hosea says it's about the exodus of the Jews with Moses. Matthew says it's about Jesus. Using the rules of grammatical historical exegesis, Matthew is unscientific. No. Prophecy is pattern. Abraham comes out of Egypt when God judges Pharaoh. His descendants, the Hebrews, come out of Egypt. God judges Pharaoh. Now God judges another wicked king, Herod. And Jesus, the seed of Abraham, comes out of Egypt. And so in our salvation, we come out of Egypt. But the ultimate coming out of Egypt, the ultimate exodus, is still to come. The exodus of the Jews is not only a picture of our salvation, it is a picture of the rapture and resurrection of the church. That is why those judgments in Exodus happen again. It is also why they brought Joseph's bones with them out of Egypt. The dead in Christ rise first. You understand? Pattern. Prophecy is pattern. This prediction fulfillment stuff, it's Western. This running around in circles is Eastern. The Bible is pattern. Okay? We've Hellenized a Hebrew faith. We have to de-Hellenize it, or we're never going to understand it. Now let's go back further. The clearest picture of the rapture and resurrection we have is the transfiguration of Jesus on Mount Hermon. The Roman Church and Greek Orthodox Church say it was Mount Tabor, which is utter nonsense. It was Mount Hermon. He was at Caesarea Philippi just before. It had to be Mount Hermon, which is an exceedingly high mountain, the text says. There's nothing exceedingly high about Mount Tabor at all. Again, if you come with us to Israel, we'll point these things out to you. On Mount Hermon, he's transfigured. He takes 3 disciples, and he's transfigured with Moses and Elijah. Why? Moses was a man who died faithful to God. Moses, after he struck the rock more than once, died on Mount Nebo and couldn't enter the Promised Land. Because Moses represents the law can't save. Moses couldn't enter the Promised Land till Jesus came. You understand? We only see him in the Promised Land after the Messiah comes, because the law couldn't save us. It could only teach us about our need for salvation. So Moses is a man who dies faithful to God. Elijah is a man who was raptured. Now you've got Jesus, you've got a man who died faithful to God, and you've got a man who was raptured. But they all look the same. We shall be as he is. It doesn't matter if you're dead in Christ when he comes, or if you're alive and we're raptured, we meet the Lord in the air. That's what was on the mountain, you understand? Peter wants to build 3 booths. Why? simply because he thought it was the messianic fulfillment of the Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Booths. He thought it was Hag Sukkot. You can get our tapes. We explain this on the typology of the Hebrew calendar. But he thought it was the Feast of Booths. He thought it was Zechariah 14. He thought it was the beginning of the millennial reign of Jesus. That's what he thought. That's why he wanted to build the booths. Okay. It's the clearest picture of the rapture and resurrection we have. Always going to be a pattern. Now, there are many, many things which teach about the rapture and resurrection. Every rapture experience you see in the Bible, every one, teaches something about the rapture. Enoch is the first. Enoch is the first. That teaches about the rapture. Paul was raptured in 2 Corinthians. John, come up hither. Revelation 4:1. Okay. Those things that John saw in the book of Revelation and the things which Paul says he couldn't describe, we're going to see those same things. Okay. Jesus ascended into heaven. He was raptured. Elijah was raptured. Every rapture experience in the Bible prefigures, teaches, highlights some aspect of the coming rapture. We looked at one word for rapture already, episunagage. It's our gathering together to be with him. It's when the dead in Christ and those who are alive when he comes meet the Lord in the air. The other word is, that's good. Harpezo. Harpezo. Caught up. Caught away. Turn with me again, please, to the book of Daniel, chapter 12. You see the tribulation. Now at that time in verse 1, Michael the prince, who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. And there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book of life, will be rescued. There's a specific meaning in this for the Jews. But there's a general meaning. See, great tribulation will be a great tribulation. Okay? Something like this has never happened at that time for your people. But everyone who's found written in the book of life will be rescued. It's always been there. The doctrine of the rapture has always been there. Rick Joyner and these guys and Gerald Coates in England and Mike Bickle, these people teaching against the rapture are deceivers. It says in Timothy, they will come going from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived. A, they're deceived themselves, and B, they're trying to deceive you. Don't let anyone tell you there is not a rescue. There is a rescue. Amen. Time for a break? I got a signal? Time for a break. How long, Margaret?